So hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now in this video we're going to do a bit of an analysis and recap of the men's time trial that's just happened in the Olympics. We're going to look at the course preview, we're going to look at the pacing strategies of some of the riders and how they fared over the different time splits, and then we're going to get into more of the nerdy stuff, the bike tech, the bike fits and the aero. So if you like this kind of stuff, give us a thumbs up, give us a subscribe and get involved in the comment section below if you've got any questions or if you think I've missed anything. So before we get into the real aero and nerdy stuff, let's have a little look at the course. And this is what made this race really interesting from a time trialling point of view. It's 2 laps for the men, 1 lap for the women, 22k for the women, 44k for the men. The first 4 kilometres is more or less all downhill, steady downhill, and then it's straight into the main climb of the lap, which is about 5k at about 5%. So it's got, you know, it's a fair thing on a time trial. The climbers are going to do well there, that's obvious. And the power guys, the heavier guys, they might struggle as, you know, the watts per CDA tends towards watts per kilogram a little bit and they might suffer from that. So if you look at my little graphic here, let me know if you think I've got this right. I've made this graphic basically just from what I observed watching the event, and then I kind of backed it up looking at the actual splits of the event. Let me know if you think I've got this right. It seems like Roglic pretty much paced the whole thing to perfection. We saw him dicing with other riders, like here we can see him like catching Asgreen and then Asgreen passing him again, and then finally Roglic retaking him. And I remember the commentators saying at the time, well, this is amazing to see, but actually if you think about time trialling, that happens all the time. If you set all the riders off at the same time and they were all ghost riders, you would see them kind of doing that yo-yo overtake all the time, and it's just those different riders pacing to their strengths. If you're a heavier rider, you're going to go faster downhill if you've got, you know, same CDA as a smaller rider. If you're a lighter rider with a higher watts per kilo but maybe not so good watts per CDA, you're going to climb faster. So we saw Asgreen taking Roglic on the downhills, and we saw Roglic taking Asgreen on every single little kicker towards the second half of the event. Now obviously Asgreen finished a fair way down, but it gives you an idea of how the riders pace these things differently depending on the physics of their body basically. Now like I said, I think Roglic obviously paced this the best. Dumoulin I think probably paced it the second best, which is why he came second, but if you look at the splits, that's what it confirms. He's very consistent with Roglic in terms of the placings over the splits. Now is that coincidence? They're on the same trade team, do they have the same tactician? Maybe, but I think it worked pretty well for them. Dennis was kind of up and down through the splits through his event. Ghana I think suffered pretty badly towards the second half of the event. I mean, normally Ghana is just so much power, he doesn't really need to worry about negative splits. That was the course, it was quite undulating. We've got that one long climb and a very long downhill, and there's some technical turns in there towards the end as well. So let me know if you think my graphic's correct. Any comments down below would be good. Now let's get into the really nerdy aero techie stuff. Now first of all, one of the early pace setters, Remco Evenepoel. If you're a small rider who's getting into time trialing, go and look at his TT position. He's probably got one of the best CDAs of any rider at that kind of height and weight. He's very fortunate enough, in terms of cycling at least, to have very kind of short little T-Rex arms, very short upper arm, so he can drop his head really low to his forearms. And he's very good at kind of rolling his shoulders forward, protracting the shoulder blades and really narrowing that frontal area. And actually his helmet, if you look at it from a frontal area point of view, his helmet actually fares most of his upper body, and his shoulders only stick out a little bit outside of the helmet. Now we'll come to that because the helmet is a streamlined object and his shoulders are a bluff body, and we'll come to why that's so important in terms of shoulder shape a bit later on. Now if you watch his run on one of the long downhills, the camera bike actually picks up him and his bike experiencing quite a nasty speed wobble. Now he's going downhill probably about 75-80 k's an hour, so there's no point pedaling, because if you're pedaling at that speed, if you're not spinning out, pedaling another 100 watts is really not going to add you maybe like half a kilometre an hour. So you're better off just getting aero and using that for recovery. There's no point pedaling extra wattage there, because you're just going to kill yourself and not go any faster. Now we can see his bike actually start to speed wobble, and it's not that really the bike's fault, it's a combination of the bike and the rider. Now when he's sat in this position, his legs aren't tense. Well, they are moderately tense, but they're not as if like he's all stiff. And what happens when you lower the stiffness of a body? You reduce its natural frequency. So the combination of him as a heavy weight sat on top of quite a stiff torsional spring, i.e. the bike, for some reason has got into a bit of resonance here. And you can see at the end of this straight on the long downhill, he kind of shakes his head. Now, is that for some other reason? I don't know. Or is it that him just being a bit freaked out as just what's happened? Because I was watching that and I was kind of wincing. It was quite interesting to see this weird speed wobble phenomenon that he couldn't like dampen that vibration. And that's because him, at that point, he's not pedaling. He's a very kind of dull, floppy dead weight on top of a spring. And that seems to be the natural resonant frequency of that system, and it was pretty horrible to watch actually. And then just before we move on, I still don't know why the Specialized Shift TT has this weird cutout in front of the back wheel. Normally that would be an aerodynamic sin. I can't see why it's there. Is it to do with relieving a high pressure in the wheel well, like a sports car might have? You know, sports cars have got like louvered wheel wells to reduce like high pressure build-up. I don't think so. Is it something to do with sharing the bike carbon mould with the triathlon bike, which has got like that bolt-on hydration system? Maybe. But aerodynamically, it just looks wrong. They all have it. All of the quick step guys have got it. And interestingly enough, I don't know why, but in Japan, I noticed this in the road race as well, no one's riding an S-Works labelled bike. They're all labelled Specialized. Does S-Works not exist in Japan? I don't know, let me know. Now I want to talk about Felipe Ghana because, okay, didn't win, spoiler alert, but he was one of the favourites, and he's such a big guy and probably the least typical road cyclist in this race and in time trialling, because he's, you know, he's a track cyclist. He's 1m93, he's like 6'3", 6'4". His bike is very personal, it's very unique to him, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the custom setup of Ghana's bike. So if we just look at this graphic here, this is a great depiction of how Ghana's bike is maxed out to meet the UCI's regulations. And because Ghana is over 190 centimetres, he can get the 85 centimetre rule, which basically means the tip of his extensions can be 85 centimetres in front of the bottom bracket. Now, I think he manages this as well, quite well, by having these custom extensions where his actually hands go on, they are mounted inwards instead of forwards, which actually saves him a few centimetres. By having his hands kind of like this instead of pointing forwards, he actually manages to shorten the end of the extension. Because they're custom, they can do that, and he can bring it maybe within that rule. It's still quite hard. Like, I'm a tall rider, I know how hard it is to get within that rule. You still feel pretty cramped up, but that's how it is. Now, Felipe Ghana's probably got one of the most extreme looking extensions or custom cockpits in the pro peloton. And that's mainly just to suit his body geometry, basically. Now, believe it or not, Pinarello don't make this Bolide bike in anything larger than 55 centimetres. And actually, if you look at the geometry chart, the bottom bracket to the top of the seat tube is about 520, which is why this bike looks so ridiculously small and it's got so much seat post sticking out for Ghana. Now, is that a good thing? And I think in this case it is, because if you went into your local bike shop and said, I want a Pinarello Bolide TT, and you were 6'5", they would say, oh, sorry, we don't make one big enough. But it actually doesn't matter. As long as you get your contact points, so the saddle, the extensions and the pedals, in the right kind of planar coordinates, X and Y's in space, the bit in between, the frame, really doesn't matter, and it's good to have it as really as small as possible to reduce the CDA of just the frame set itself. And we saw this with Bradley Wiggins back in London 2012, came out with a UK Sports Institute bike, which looked like it was designed for a 12-year-old, and he had more seat posts sticking out than the actual frame seat tube itself. And he's got quite a high stack on the front, although by modern standards that's actually still quite low. But it's that same ethos, is if you can get the contact points and the power points in the right coordinates, the bit holding it together in between probably should be as small and as light as possible. But for Ghana, to get the reach that he needs from that smaller frame, the extensions need to be pushed way forward. So the pylons, or the mounts for the extensions, are raked all the way forward. Now, the UCI stipulate that the cross-section of that extension pylon can only be 40mm in length, but that's a perpendicular section through the part. Now, due to the rake of Ghana's extension mount, the real chord length of that aerofoil becomes more like 60mm, so he's actually getting a slight benefit from having that extreme lean forward on the pylons. It's making a slightly longer chord of the aerofoil, which should be a little bit more aerodynamic and a bit lower drag. It's marginal, but it's just a little point. Now, Ghana rides with quite a high wrist and hand position. Now, the hard thing to get that inside the rules with the UCI is that the middle of the elbow pads have to be within 100mm from the very tip of the extensions. Now, Ghana achieves this in his custom way by basically moving the elbow pad all the way up the extension, so it's quite close in height-wise to the tip. If he was to have it supporting right down on his elbow, it would be over 100mm below the tip of the extension, and it would be illegal. So by shifting it all the way up his forearm, which probably isn't the best for comfort and stability, he manages to keep it within the 100mm rule. He's got probably one of the widest frames of most of the time trialists. He's more of a trackie, but he has a very good ability to really round the shoulders forward, to really like rotate the shoulders and protract the shoulders to reduce his frontal area. And whilst doing that, he also manages to dip his head into that gap. Now, when you have really rounded shoulders on a TT bike, like if the front end is way too low, it becomes quite hard to actually dip the head. But he can also achieve that, which is quite unique. And the good thing about having those extensions so far out ahead is that he likes to ride with a very inclined upper arm angle. Whereas if you look at someone like Rowan Dennis here, his arms are almost 90 degrees to the wind and 90 degrees to the torso, which is presenting his upper arm as basically a cylinder, which is probably one of the worst shapes for the air to try and stay attached to, and the induced vortex behind that shape is going to be bigger than Ghana's, because Ghana is inclining his arm. He's riding with his arms really far forward, so he's not presenting a cylinder to the wind, he's presenting more of an ellipse. If you look at the angle of incidence of the wind and you take a section through his arm, that is not a cylinder, it's more like an ellipse, which is hopefully going to be a bit lower drag than a cylinder. Now compare that to Dennis's position. He's got more of a 90 degree arm position to the torso, and it's more 90 degrees to the the free stream air, so he's presenting a cylinder to the air, which is probably a bit higher drag. But then again, Dennis's position looks a bit more upright. He's got kind of this upward trajectory of his upper back, whereas Ghana's upper back is almost pointing downhill, and Dennis's position from a power point of view does look a bit more comfortable than Ghana's. And it's all a trade-off, like I said, between power divided by CDA. And what works for one might not work for the other. And just like we touched on earlier, let's talk about shoulders and why I think shoulder shape is one of the most important things if you're going to be a good time trialist. Particularly in the modern peloton, we see all the time trialists are very skinny shouldered, and if they're not, they're doing things to alleviate that, like Ghana's massive shoulder rotation like I spoke about a minute ago. So just a few examples on the screen. I know he wasn't in the race, but Jonas Vingegaard, Jumbo-Visma rider, basically the majority of his frontal area of his upper body is fed by the helmet, or is covered by the helmet, which is a streamline shape. You're allowed to streamline that. You're not allowed to streamline the shoulders, that goes against the rules. But my point is, the bigger the proportion of your helmet to your upper body frontal area, the better you are. It's like if you've got extremely wide shoulders, you are really punished. Now even the bigger guys like Van Aert, who's a plus 80 kilo rider, he's actually pretty narrow shouldered for a bigger guy. Another one on the screen here, Remco Evenepoel. You look at his frontal area from the front, most of his upper body is fed by the helmet as well, so he's really using that helmet not just to fare the head, but it covers a lot of his frontal area as well. There are other wider shoulder riders down the list, like Patrick Bevan also did a very good TT. I think he was in the top 10. He's quite a wide shouldered guy for not being the tallest rider. There's a little bit of a disadvantage there. But if you look mainly in the kind of top four, you got Dennis and Kung. Now Kung is again 6'3", 6'4", 193 centimeters. He's very narrow for that kind of build. If you took a 193 centimeter triathlete, swimmer, rower, and I'm not talking about muscle, I'm talking about just skeletal width, he's very narrow for that kind of height. So yeah, he's big, but he's still good for that height. But he's at a slight disadvantage because naturally he's a big guy, he's got wider shoulders. Same with Dennis. Dennis is actually quite a bit shorter than Kung, but he's got more of like a swimmer or a triathlete body, so he's got like wider shoulders. Now I would say these two aren't helped at all by their helmet choice. Compared to the narrower guys, the helmet really isn't faring much for them at all. It's pretty much just fairing the head, and their shoulders are just big bluff bodies in the wind. Now we see on other parts of their bike, like wheel choice and tyre choice, they do go against the sponsor. So why have they not gone against the sponsor in terms of helmet choice? Because I think for both these riders there are better helmets out there to kind of help fare their shoulders. Thank me later guys, it's not a popular choice, but I don't know, maybe, I'm sure they've tested these. The POC Tempor does tend to favour guys with slightly wider shoulders because it kind of gives you a bit of a fairing onto the shoulders, transitions the air onto the back a bit better if you've got wider shoulders. So could they have experimented with that? Have they experimented with that? I'm sure they have, but yeah, you put it on their heads, it looks alright because they're a bit wider. Now a quick word on good old Tom Dumoulin, the fastest man with IBS on a bike ever. He's returned to racing. He took time off since about January, I think it was. He's just come back, and since he's come back, he's not done too bad. So he's got national champs jersey in the TT for the Netherlands, and he's just won silver at the Olympic Games. So whatever he's done, the break he took from pro cycling, decided that the idiots in pro cycling were doing his head in, and he didn't really have the enthusiasm to train for the punishment he was putting his body and his family through. Decided he's come back and give it another crack, and he's done pretty well. Now, what's surprising about Dumoulin is his equipment choice, or what he was given, or what he chose, I'm not sure, was basically a stock Cervelo TT bike. Okay, it's like the top end one, but if you look at the cockpit, it's pretty much what comes stock on the bike. It's no fancy one-piece custom moulded extensions for him. He's just got the cylindrical extensions on there. Now, is that a disadvantage, or could that be an advantage? Could he have tested that in the wind tunnel? A lot of people are claiming that, he could have gone 30 seconds, 40 seconds faster with a custom cockpit. Personally, I don't know how you can come up to those conclusions without real outdoor testing. You can't just say there's a 5 watt, a 10 watt difference for every rider. The nuances of aerodynamics are just too specific to apply that as a blanket rule. So I'm trying to say, just because it doesn't look good, it might not be that it's slower. So there's like a number of reasons why I don't think it's that bad. And if you look at this picture, the frontal area of the cylindrical extensions is very small anyway. So the horizontal part of the extensions, just like he used to ride when he was riding his Giant Trinity, when he was the best TT'er going, well, the horizontal part of the cylindrical extension doesn't really have any frontal area because it's in parallel with the free stream. And then the slight ski bend at the end of the extension, don't forget that's not a cylinder anyway, because at that angle of incidence, at that section, it's an ellipse, just like we were talking about Ghana's arm. So I don't think it's that punishing. And there is a small case for a slight pre-tripping of the air in front of the forearm. So it's pre-tripping the air with that slight bit of extension, helping it go over the forearm, or reducing the induced drag from the forearm alone. There's a case for that. So I'm just saying, just because he doesn't have that one-piece extension custom cockpit doesn't mean it's a disadvantage. Maybe he's actually tested this and it's faster, because he used to ride the custom one-piece cockpit when he was on the Bianchi TT bike. And now he's gone back to a bike fit and, you know, pole system, which is very, very similar to what he used to ride to great success on the Giant Trinity. So the only bad thing I would say about this equipment choice is that it seems in these pictures, and I've seen this a lot with Dumoulin, is that he is only contacting the forearm right at the back of the pad. So he's only on basically a line contact on the forearm. Now that's not very stable and it can't be very comfortable. So Tom, if you're watching, I've got a few spaces left in the Pete Talk web shop. Head on over to the website and set you up, and we'll angle that pad onto your forearm just like you were on the Bianchi. Drop me a line there, we'll sort you out. Now I want to talk about the Shiv TT again. Now I've noticed this with quite a lot of the riders over the last couple of seasons that have been using this new Shiv. Why is the base bar so wide when most of the best TTers and climbers that need, you know, that Shiv TT on that team, even Asgreen, who's a very slender but tall rider, has very narrow shoulders, quite narrow hips. It seems like from the frontal shots that the base bar is actually outside the width of the rider's legs. Now, is there a case for making that as narrow as possible because of how good they are and how good the bike fits are on the extensions? Only when it's really technical we see the riders on the base bar. But why are we adding frontal area outside of the rider's legs when we don't really need it to be there? Should we reduce the width of the base bar and almost set up like this vortex, this Y250 vortex effect, to try and energize the air before it goes over the thighs and the calves? Because the induced drag you get from the thighs and the calves is pretty huge. It would be really great if we could energize that air, like pre-trip it before we went over the calves and the thighs. And by clever spacing of the brake levers and the width of the base bar for each rider, I think there's something to be done there. Now we can see on Ghana's bike, he's got pretty much the lowest base bar position he can. It's got an actual drop on the base bar. Considering that bike is tiny for him anyway, it's got a drop on the base bar and it's very, very narrow because he's hardly ever on it. And it looks like maybe they've set that up to trip a vortex before it goes over the lower leg, which we know is pretty bad because the lower leg's a cylinder. Energizing that air, can we energize the air with the brake levers and the width of the base bar carefully? But skinny riders with wide base bars just don't get it. Quick note about wheel choice. Hardly anyone in the top 10, as far as I know. I think Kung was the only rider using a tri-spoke. Most of the riders on spoked wheels seems to be pretty good for most of the riders. Top 2 riders on Aerocoach spoke wheels, disc brakes again, and the disc brakes that everyone seems to be using are the XTR disc brakes. Like, we're not even using the Road, the Dura Ace disc brakes. It seems like riders have gone towards the XTR disc brakes. I had them on my road bike before I decided they were shit. Disc brakes don't seem to be slowing anyone down, and spoked wheels seem to be okay now. I think we had, yeah, top 2 on Aerocoach, 100mm deep wheel, and then you got Dennis using the Princeton Carbon Works wheel. And then Kung was the rider on the tri-spoke, I think. Now the Ineos riders, Thomas, Dennis, Ghana, Port, all using the Princeton carbon wheels, including the Blur disc wheel, which is basically just a normal spoked wheel with Sapim CX race spokes with 2 carbon discs bonded on top. Doesn't look that great in my opinion, but seems to work for them. Make of that what you will. Doesn't even seem that balanced from this video either. Now we see this all the time with TT bikes and road bikes in the Pro Peloton. We see these beautiful frames and then a timing chip is zip tied or stuck under a piece of inner tube to the fork. Now why we keep seeing this? Timing chips have been around for ages, they work, the design doesn't change that much. Why aren't we integrating them into the bike design? Why aren't we recessing them into the carbon 3D and covering it with a little trapdoor? Why are we still bodging them on the outside? You know, you don't have an F1 car and then zip tie the FIA telemetry box onto the outside, do you? No, it's designed as part of the chassis, it's hidden away, it's out the wind, so let's do that with bikes, come on. And finally, how many oversized jockey wheels did you see in the top 10? There we go. Cheers, see you in the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave some comments down below.